Jake had always dreamed of visiting Europe, and when the chance finally came, he couldn't contain his excitement. He had heard so much about the old castles, palaces, and rich history of the continent. One of the places on his must-see list was the Royal Palace, a magnificent building that stood tall, guarding the city's ancient past. His friends, equally excited by the idea of traveling abroad, couldn't wait to join him on this adventure. They had planned this trip for months, and everything seemed perfect. On the first day of their sightseeing tour, Jake found himself standing in awe before the grand entrance of the Royal Palace. The sheer size of the palace took his breath away, with its towering stone walls, elegant gates, and golden details glimmering in the sun. But what caught Jake's attention the most were the royal guards, stationed in front of the gates. They stood still as statues, dressed in traditional uniforms, their faces expressionless, and their eyes focused on their duty. They were like living symbols of the country's long-standing traditions, and their disciplined stance fascinated Jake. "Man, these guards are so serious," Jake remarked to his friends, laughing. He had always been someone who enjoyed a good joke, and the stillness of the guards made him think of something fun to do. His friends noticed the glint of mischief in his eyes, and one of them, Chris, nudged him. "Go on, do something. See if you can make one of them react," Chris teased. Jake was known for being playful and a bit of a prankster. He had never been one to back down from a challenge. "All right, I'll do it," Jake said, a grin spreading across his face. The idea seemed harmless enough to him. After all, the guards were just standing there, doing their job. What could possibly go wrong? He wasn't planning anything dangerous, just a little prank. He figured he could approach one of the guards, give him a little surprise, and maybe snap a photo of the reaction for his social media. It would be hilarious, and everyone would laugh about it later. As Jake approached the nearest guard, he took a deep breath, trying to suppress the excitement bubbling up inside him. His friends stood back, eager to see what would happen next. The guard didn't move a muscle as Jake stepped closer, his heart pounding in anticipation. He had to be quick. Without giving it much thought, Jake reached for the ceremonial rifle that hung across the guard's shoulder. His fingers closed around the weapon, giving it a little tug. It was supposed to be a harmless joke, a playful move to see how the guard would react. But the moment his hand touched the rifle, something unexpected happened. The guard, who had been perfectly still, seemed to come alive in an instant. Without any hesitation, he spun around, his movements sharp and precise, and the next thing Jake knew, he felt a forceful push against his chest. The rifle was yanked away from his hands in one swift motion, and Jake was caught off guard by the sudden strength and authority of the guard. He stumbled backward, his surprise turning into confusion. This wasn't the reaction he had expected at all. What had seemed like a simple prank had quickly turned into something much more serious. His friends fell silent, and Jake's stomach sank as he realized just how much trouble he might be in. The guard's stern expression remained unchanged, and Jake couldn't help but feel a rush of embarrassment. But it wasn't just the guard's reaction that shocked him. It was the fact that no one around him had expected such a fast response. As he stood there, trying to regain his balance and figure out what to do next, Jake couldn't help but wonder if he had just made a huge mistake. Jake quickly tried to gather his thoughts, but everything was happening so fast. The forceful push from the guard had left him stunned, and he took a couple of steps back to regain his balance. His heart raced, and he could feel the blood rush to his face in a mixture of embarrassment and shock. He had never expected things to escalate this quickly. The guard's eyes never left him, his posture perfectly straight and unyielding. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that this wasn't just a simple prank anymore. The guard's stern expression made it clear that he wasn't someone who would tolerate such behavior. The weapon, which Jake had thought would be easy to play with, now seemed like a serious symbol of authority and discipline. For a moment, there was only silence. The crowd around them had stopped talking, and all eyes were on Jake. He could hear whispers from tourists nearby, and the tension in the air was thick. It felt like the whole world had frozen, and Jake was the center of it all. His friends stood behind him, their faces pale with worry. They had been just as excited for the prank, but now it seemed like they were starting to realize that Jake had gone too far. Jake opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. He wanted to explain that it was just a joke, that he hadn't meant to cause trouble. But the guard's glare told him there was no room for explanations. The guard had his rifle back in his hands now, gripping it with calm precision. He stood still, waiting, but Jake could see that the situation was becoming more serious by the second. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the courtyard. More guards appeared, moving quickly and efficiently. They weren't running, but there was no mistaking the urgency in their movements. They surrounded Jake, their eyes sharp and focused on him. Jake's stomach tightened. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had never imagined that a prank, something he thought would be fun, would lead to a situation like this. The new guards didn't speak at first. They just stood there, watching him with a look that made Jake feel like a child caught misbehaving. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had done something unforgivable. His hands began to sweat, and his mouth went dry. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The weight of their stares seemed to pin him in place. A voice broke the silence. It wasn't the original guard, but one of the newcomers. "Step away from him," the voice ordered, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. The command was firm, and Jake instinctively took a step back, his mind racing. The guard closest to him reached out and gently grabbed his arm, guiding him away from the original guard. Jake didn't resist, but he couldn't help feeling a sense of dread creeping over him. He had only intended to have a little fun, but now, standing in front of a group of stern-faced guards, he couldn't help but wonder how he could get out of this mess. He had never been in trouble like this before, and the thought of what might happen next made him feel more nervous than he had ever felt in his life. His friends, still standing behind him, exchanged uneasy glances. Jake could tell that they, too, were starting to realize the severity of the situation. They hadn't expected things to go this far. All the jokes and laughter had faded, replaced by a heavy silence that hung over them like a storm cloud. It was clear to everyone now that this was no longer a lighthearted moment. It was something much more serious. Jake's mind was spinning, and his stomach twisted in knots as he was guided away from the guard. The realization that he had made a huge mistake started to hit him like a wave. He couldn't believe it. He had thought this whole thing would be a laugh, a harmless little prank, but now it was spiraling out of control. His heart pounded in his chest as the guards continued to circle him, their movements calm but precise, like they had done this 1,000 times before. One of the guards who had arrived later spoke in a low, commanding voice, telling Jake to stop moving. It was the kind of voice that left no room for doubt or argument. It wasn't angry, but it was serious, and that seriousness sent a chill through Jake's spine. His legs felt weak beneath him, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he could even stand up straight. His body was filled with a mix of regret, fear, and confusion. How had things escalated so quickly? The original guard, who Jake had tried to prank, still stood in his place, unmoving and as serious as ever. His eyes were locked onto Jake, and it felt like they were piercing through him, seeing right into the core of his mistake. Jake couldn't look away. The guard's composure was intimidating, and the feeling of being judged by someone so calm and unwavering only made Jake feel more embarrassed. His friends had gone silent, and he could feel their eyes on him too, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered now except the guards and the serious situation he had put himself in. "What do we do now?" Chris whispered, but Jake barely heard him. All he could focus on was the growing tension around him. The group of guards seemed to close in even more, creating a circle that made Jake feel trapped. His friends stood at the edges of the group, uncertain, unsure of how to help him. Before Jake could say anything, a man in a suit, presumably part of the royal security, walked over to them. His face was stern, but there was a hint of frustration in his eyes. He seemed to be the one in charge. He didn't shout or raise his voice, but the weight of his authority was clear. His first words were calm but firm. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he asked, directing his question toward Jake. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. He knew what he wanted to say, that it was a joke, that he never meant to cause any harm. But as the man's eyes bore into him, Jake realized that no excuse would undo what he had done. His simple joke had now turned into something much bigger. The embarrassment was overwhelming, and the pit in his stomach grew even deeper. I didn't mean any harm," Jake stammered, his voice shaking slightly. "I just thought it would be funny. I didn't know. I didn't think it would be like this." The security officer looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. "You have no idea how serious this is to you," the officer said, his tone much colder now. "You've interfered with a royal guard, and that's not something we take lightly. You could be looking at serious consequences." Jake swallowed hard. The gravity of his mistake was starting to hit him fully. He had no idea what the consequences might be, but the officer's words made it clear that they wouldn't be pleasant. His mind raced as he tried to think of something, anything, to make the situation better, but there was nothing he could say that would erase the tension in the air. He felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him now, and the reality of what he had done settled in. The situation was no longer a joke. It had turned into something he didn't know how to handle. The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It wasn't just the stares from the guards or the stern look from the security officer. It was the sense that something was about to happen that could change everything. He had always been known as the fun, carefree guy who loved a good laugh, but now, standing in the middle of the palace courtyard, he felt completely out of his depth. The realization of what he had done was sinking in, and it felt like a heavy burden. The security officer took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he spoke again. "You understand that this is a serious matter, right? You're not in your hometown now. Here, things are different. The Royal Guard isn't some performer you can mess with." Jake's mind was racing. He tried to find the right words, but it felt like his throat was closing up. What could he possibly say? The officer was right. He was in a foreign country, surrounded by rules he didn't fully understand, and his actions had just crossed a line he hadn't even known existed. One of the guards, still holding the rifle, took a step forward and spoke in a deep, calm voice. "We are trained to protect, not to entertain." Jake's heart sank. He hadn't thought about it like that. To the guards, it wasn't just a joke. It was their duty, their role in preserving something bigger than any prank. They weren't there to laugh or smile at tourists' jokes. They were there to serve and protect, and Jake's actions had disrupted that. "Sir, we were just having fun." Jake tried again, his voice faltering. His friends, standing silently in the background, were still processing what was happening. They had no idea what to do or say either. It felt like the air itself was thick with discomfort. The tourists around them continued to whisper and glance nervously at the scene unfolding before them. Some were even taking out their phones, but Jake was too overwhelmed to notice. His entire focus was on the guards, the security officer, and the dire consequences he was now facing. The officer, clearly not moved by Jake's words, took a deep breath and nodded to the guards. "Take him away." Those words, simple and direct, struck Jake like a bolt of lightning. His entire body froze. The guards moved in swiftly, taking hold of Jake's arms with firm but controlled grips. He didn't resist, not because he wanted to comply, but because he knew there was no point. He had crossed a line, and now he had to face the consequences. As Jake was escorted away from the scene, he could feel the eyes of every single person around him. Some of the tourists seemed to watch with curiosity, while others appeared to share his embarrassment. His friends remained silent, unsure of what to say or do. Jake couldn't even look at them. He felt too humiliated, too small. He had no idea where they were taking him, but he had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to be a simple matter of apologizing and walking away. They'd marched him through the palace grounds, and Jake couldn't help but notice the solemn faces of the other guards who stood watch. It was as if the entire royal palace had a different energy now, one that was serious and unyielding. The guards around him were silent, but their presence felt like a weight on his shoulders. They didn't need to speak. Their silence was enough to remind Jake that he wasn't dealing with just any situation. He was in trouble, and this was no small matter. As they reached a small, secure building on the palace grounds, Jake couldn't help but wonder just how deep the trouble ran. What was going to happen to him? Would he be taken to jail? Would he face serious charges? Every step he took only seemed to deepen his sense of dread. The fantasy of a fun vacation had quickly turned into a nightmare that he never could have imagined. Jake was led into a small plain room that smelled faintly of old wood and polished stone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the soft sound echoed in the stillness. He was left alone, sitting on a hard wooden chair, his arms still gently held by two guards who stood nearby, observing him with impassive faces. His heart was racing, and the pit in his stomach only deepened as the minutes passed. The reality of his situation was sinking in more and more with each passing second. He had never been in a situation like this before. Back home, a small prank might have earned him a few laughs, maybe even a reprimand from a friend or family member. But here, in a foreign land, surrounded by royal guards and serious security officers, he was beginning to understand just how out of his element he really was. His casual attitude toward the whole situation had vanished, replaced by a deep sense of regret. The door opened suddenly, and a man in a dark suit entered. He had the air of someone important, his face serious but not unkind. He was older than Jake, with neatly combed hair and sharp features that gave him an authoritative presence. The man's eyes briefly met Jake's before he took a seat across from him, folding his hands together on the table. Jake swallowed hard, feeling the cold bead of sweat trickle down his neck. The man didn't immediately speak. Instead, he studied Jake quietly for a moment. The silence stretched on, and Jake was too nervous to break it. He could feel his thoughts swirling, each one more panicked than the last. What would happen to him? Would he be arrested? Would he be sent home? His mind raced with 1,000 questions, but he couldn't bring himself to voice any of them. Finally, the man spoke. "You've caused a great deal of trouble today," he said calmly. His voice was steady, yet it carried the weight of authority. Jake's mouth went dry, and he nodded weakly, knowing that he deserved every word of it. He hadn't meant for this to happen, but he had crossed a line, and now he had to face the consequences. I didn't think it would go this far," Jake stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "It was just a joke. I never meant to cause harm or disrespect." The words felt hollow as soon as they left his mouth. He had said them 1,000 times in his mind, but now they seemed inadequate. How could he explain that he hadn't understood the gravity of the situation? How could he make them see that his intention had never been to break any laws? The man leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You may not have intended harm, but you did. When you interfere with the guards' duties, you disrupt the security of this place. These men are not here to entertain tourists. They have a job to do, a job that requires the utmost respect and discipline." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in. Jake felt his face burn with shame. He had underestimated the seriousness of the situation and the responsibility the guards had. In his mind, they had been statues, silent, unmoving figures that added to the atmosphere of the palace. But he had forgotten that they were real people with real duties, and their role in the country's security was far from a joke. "I understand," Jake said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. He wasn't sure if he truly understood all the implications, but he knew one thing for sure. He had messed up. He had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. The man nodded, seeming satisfied with Jake's response. "You will have to face the consequences of your actions. We take security very seriously here, and you have broken an important rule. However, given that you are a foreign tourist, and this was your first offense, we will take your intent into account when determining the appropriate course of action." Jake felt a small sense of relief at those words, but it was fleeting. It wasn't over yet. He had no idea what consequences he might face, and the uncertainty made the situation feel even worse. The man stood up, signaling that their conversation was coming to an end. "I will report your actions to the authorities," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You will be contacted soon. For now, you will remain here." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Jake alone once more with his thoughts. The door clicked shut behind him, and Jake slumped back in his chair. He couldn't help but replay the events over and over in his mind. He had been foolish, careless, and now he had to pay for it. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain: his vacation had taken a... Jake sat in the small room, the silence pressing in on him like a heavy weight. His mind was still spinning from everything that had happened. What had started as a harmless prank had now spiraled into something far more serious. He couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head when he grabbed the guard's rifle. If only he could turn back time and stop himself from making that impulsive decision. But now, it was too late. The minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly. Jake was no longer sure how long he had been sitting there, but the clock on the wall ticked away the seconds like a countdown to something inevitable. His legs were stiff from sitting still for so long, and he had to fight the urge to get up and pace. Every time he tried to distract himself, his thoughts drifted back to the situation at hand. What would happen next? Would they send him home? Would he have to face legal action? His stomach churned at the thought. The door opened again, and Jake quickly straightened in his chair, his heart skipping a beat. This time, a younger man stepped inside, wearing a simple uniform. He didn't have the same stern authority as the man in the suit, but his presence was still commanding in its own way. The man glanced at Jake, his eyes briefly scanning the room before locking onto him. "All right, come with me," the man said simply. Jake hesitated for a moment, uncertain. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer directly, but his expression softened slightly. "Don't worry. We're just taking you to another room for a little while. You'll be all right," he said, his tone calm, but there was still a sense of urgency in his voice. Jake stood up slowly, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. He followed the man out of the room, trying to gather his bearings. The hallway was quiet, with only the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty space. They passed several other doors, each one closed and silent. Jake couldn't help but wonder what was behind them. Were they cells? Were other tourists caught in similar situations? His mind kept racing, but he couldn't focus on anything for long. As they turned a corner, the man finally spoke again. "We just need to sort a few things out," he said, but Jake still didn't understand what that meant. They stopped in front of another door, and the man knocked lightly before pushing it open. Inside was a small room, nothing special, with a simple desk and a couple of chairs. The walls were bare, and there was a small window letting in natural light from outside. "Sit down here. I'll get someone to speak with you soon," the man said, motioning toward one of the chairs. Jake sat down cautiously, trying to steady his breathing. He was still processing everything, but he could tell that this wasn't as bad as it had seemed earlier. At least he wasn't being dragged away somewhere even worse. Maybe he was going to be let off with a warning. Maybe they would just send him home with a stern lecture. But the uncertainty was still there, gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was still in trouble. The way the security officer had looked at him, the way the guards had moved with such precision. It all felt so serious. Jake didn't know what the outcome would be, but he had a sinking feeling that it wasn't going to be a simple apology and a pat on the back. The man left the room, closing the door behind him. Jake was left alone again, his thoughts swirling like a storm in his mind. What had he learned from this experience? He had always been someone who took life lightly, who loved a good laugh, and didn't worry too much about the consequences. But now he realized just how wrong he had been. What might seem like a harmless joke to one person could be seen as a major violation to someone else. He had taken something sacred, something serious, and turned it into a game, without fully understanding the significance of it. For the first time, Jake felt the weight of his actions fully. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Whether he was going to be let off easy or face serious consequences, he didn't know. But one thing was certain. He had learned a hard lesson about respect and the consequences of his actions. Jake sat in the room, the minutes dragging on in complete silence. He tried to keep his mind calm, but his thoughts kept racing back to the events that had led him here. The image of the Royal Guard's stern face, the sudden shift in the atmosphere when things turned serious. Everything felt so surreal. He had never been in trouble like this before, and now he was completely at a loss. How did a simple prank end up turning his vacation into something that might change everything? The sound of footsteps approaching broke the silence. Jake's heart skipped a beat, and he looked up instinctively, though he tried to hide the nervousness he felt. The door opened, and the man in the suit, the one who had spoken to him earlier, walked in. This time, his expression was a little softer, though there was still an air of authority about him. "Jake, is it?" the man asked, as he sat down across from him. His voice was calm, measured. "I know this situation hasn't been easy for you, but we need to figure out how to resolve this." Jake nodded quickly, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I understand," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. It was just a stupid joke. I never thought it would go this far." The man studied him for a moment, his eyes scanning Jake's face. It wasn't an accusing stare, but one that seemed to gauge his sincerity. "I believe you," the man said quietly. "I don't think you intended harm. But you need to understand that your actions were taken very seriously. The Royal Guard plays an important role in our country's security, and what you did wasn't just a harmless prank." Jake bit his lip, nodding again. The reality of the situation was sinking in deeper. He had crossed a line, and no matter how much he regretted it, there was no taking it back. He had disrupted something important, and the consequences were real. "I know," Jake said, his voice soft now. "I was wrong. I see that now. I'm really sorry." The man nodded, seeming to accept his apology, though the seriousness of the situation remained. "You need to be more mindful of where you are and who you're dealing with," he said. "What might seem like a joke in your country might not be understood the same way here." Jake took a deep breath, trying to hold back the wave of emotions that were threatening to overwhelm him. "I was just having fun," he said, almost to himself. "I didn't think about what it could mean." The man leaned forward slightly, his tone firm but not unkind. "I know you didn't, and that's why we're giving you a chance to make this right. But you need to understand that not everyone will be so understanding. You've gotten lucky that we are treating this with some leniency." Jake's heart thudded in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was a good thing that the man was offering him leniency, or if it meant he was still facing serious consequences. His mind spun as he tried to take in the words. He could sense that the situation was serious, but it didn't feel like it was over yet. It was as though he was dangling in uncertainty, waiting for the final decision that would determine what happened to him next. The man paused for a moment, letting his words settle. Then he spoke again, this time in a slightly softer tone. "We have a system in place for situations like yours. You'll need to stay for a little longer while we finalize our decision, but we'll make sure you are treated fairly." Jake tried to absorb the information, but he felt like his brain was working in slow motion. The uncertainty was suffocating. He had no idea what kind of decision they would make. Would he be sent home with a warning? Would he be fined or worse? Every possible outcome played out in his mind, none of them offering any real comfort. "I'll try my best to make things right," Jake said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. He didn't know what that would mean yet, but he knew that he had to make an effort. This experience had already taught him more about the importance of respect and understanding than he ever wanted to learn. The man stood up, signaling that their conversation was coming to an end. "We'll let you know what happens soon," he said. "Just stay calm, and we'll handle the rest." As the door closed behind him, Jake was left alone again. But this time, it didn't feel as isolating. The uncertainty still weighed heavily on him, but a small part of him felt a little bit of hope. Maybe this wouldn't be as bad as he had feared. Maybe he could get through this and learn from his mistake. Hours seemed to pass in a blur, though Jake couldn't be sure how much time had actually gone by. He was still sitting in the small, quiet room, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic mix of regret, worry, and anxiety. His earlier moments of fear had faded slightly, replaced now by a deep sense of waiting. What was going to happen? Was this going to be something he could walk away from, or had he made a mistake so serious that his entire vacation, maybe even his future, was in jeopardy? He hadn't spoken to anyone since the man in the suit left. It was as if the room had become a waiting ground, where nothing could be done but reflect on what had happened. He replayed every moment over and over, wishing he had just thought before acting. Maybe if he had understood the importance of what he was doing, he wouldn't be sitting there now, waiting for a decision that could change everything. The sound of footsteps approaching once again broke his thoughts. This time, when the door opened, it wasn't the man in the suit who stepped inside. It was a different person. Someone younger, in a simple uniform, but with a friendly, approachable demeanor. The man smiled warmly at Jake as he entered, and for the first time, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe things were starting to turn around. "Jake, right?" the man asked, his voice calm and friendly. Jake nodded, feeling a little less tense at the kindness in the man's tone. "Yeah, that's me." The man sat down across from Jake, the chair creaking slightly as he adjusted. "Well, I got some news for you. The authorities have reviewed the situation, and I'm happy to tell you that we've decided to release you without any serious consequences." Jake's heart leaped in his chest. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Wait, really?" he asked, hardly daring to hope. The man nodded. "Yes, we understand that this was a misunderstanding, and that you didn't have any malicious intent. However, you must understand the seriousness of the situation. The Royal Guard's duties are not to be taken lightly, and what you did could have disrupted the entire security system if it had escalated." Jake swallowed hard, his nerves still on edge. "I get it. I really do. I'm sorry." The man smiled, though there was a seriousness to his expression. "You seem genuinely remorseful, and we appreciate that. We'll be issuing a warning, and we'll ask that you sign an agreement acknowledging your understanding of the situation. There will be no charges or fines, but we want to make sure this kind of incident doesn't happen again." Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief flooded through him, and his tense body seemed to relax. He still couldn't believe he was getting off without facing more serious consequences. "I really appreciate this," Jake said, his voice full of gratitude. "I swear I've learned my lesson. I won't make this mistake again." The man nodded approvingly. "I'm glad to hear that. We know that sometimes things get lost in translation, especially with tourists. But it's important to remember that different cultures and countries have different standards and rules. The best thing you can do is respect them, even if you don't fully understand them." Jake nodded eagerly, feeling a deep sense of understanding now. This wasn't just about avoiding punishment. It was about respecting the place and people around him. It was a valuable lesson that he knew would stay with him long after this incident was behind him. The man stood up, offering Jake a hand to shake. "You'll be free to go shortly. Just sign the paperwork, and you'll be on your way. Take this as a learning experience, and be more mindful in the future." Jake took the man's hand, shaking it firmly. "Thank you. I promise I'll be more careful next time." With that, the man walked out of the room, leaving Jake to gather his thoughts. A few minutes later, he was handed the paperwork and signed it with a feeling of relief. He couldn't help but smile to himself as he walked out of the building. His vacation, which had started off with such excitement and promise, had taken an unexpected turn, but in the end, he was getting away with a lesson learned and a second chance. As Jake stepped back into the warm sunlight, the weight that had been pressing on him for hours finally lifted. He could still hear the laughter and chatter of the tourists around him, but now he understood what it meant to respect the place he was visiting. No more jokes at the expense of those who took their responsibilities seriously. It was a hard lesson, but one he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. It was a moment of quiet reflection, but it was also the beginning of something new, an understanding of the world that he would carry with him, no matter where he went next.